Good morning. My name is Chris Fox, and today we are talking about ancient civilizations like Atlantis and why I believe that there definitely was at least one of them that we don't know about. So, a forgotten civilization that existed probably in the neighborhood of 12,000 years ago or longer, and why so many people believe that to be true. And this, of course, is following up on the heels of my last video, How to Write Your Novel, because I'm writing an archaeological thriller. Well, here's the archaeological evidence behind my theories in the book. We're going to begin with this. Think about our civilization. Imagine if all the people disappeared tomorrow, so our civilization breaks down. Maybe there are a few survivors, but in general, 99.9% of all people are dead, and we've kind of been wiped out. Maybe an asteroid hit the planet or something. How much of our civilization would survive in 10,000 years? And I deep dived on this, like autistically, like a lot. And as it turns out, one of the very few things that would survive would be Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore will be here in 500,000 years. It'll be here for 500,000 years. It would still be proof that people had been here. That was the point of the monument, to really leave a lasting impression on the world that you've done something momentous and a monument for the ages. But other than that, there's almost nothing that would remain. All cities are gone, and we've seen this throughout history, because what happens is they're scavenged by new cities, and new cities are built on top of the old cities. Everything they find, stone, wood, metals of any kind, it's all taken and used elsewhere. I mean, that's ultimately what we do as a species. We are scavengers first. We'll build something from scratch if we have to, but if it already exists, why wouldn't you just use that? The cities that we envision today, if you're looking at kind of a post-apocalyptic world, would be picked clean very quickly. And the only things that would exist would be some trace elements, like maybe some plastics that don't quite break down, or possibly nuclear power plants, there'd be some remains there. And so the question to ask is, if there was an ancient civilization, wouldn't they also have left similar fingerprints to that? And the answer is we believe they have, actually. So to look at the nuclear power plant example, there is a pyramid in China that appears to be a mountain. So there's some debate. Is this a pyramid? Is this a mountain? You know, people will debate it on both sides, but it's a pyramidal shaped mountain. And underneath this mountain are a series of pipes that go out into a local lake. They're called the Baigong pipes. And these pipes are radioactive. So they're made out of something like bamboo, which scientists have said probably means they're a natural occurrence. And yes, they grow in symmetrical patterns. And yes, these symmetrical patterns appear to be a drainage system for something like a nuclear power plant. But they're probably just natural because there are other similar natural formations in rock, especially. If you look at like Devil's Postpile, it looks man-made, but it's not. So their contention is this is not man-made. And maybe they're right. But if they are right, why are these pipes radioactive? Good question. Really good question. The Indian Vedas, the Vedas out of India, mention something that sounds a good deal like a nuclear bomb, and that it's used multiple times. Well, certainly if that's true, if the lore behind the Vedas is true, and we're talking over 100,000 years of lore, it goes way, way back. If a nuclear weapon had been detonated, wouldn't that leave some evidence? Sure. In fact, what it usually leaves is something called nuclear glass. So in a given location, it'll turn sand into a green glass like we find all over the Sahara. Does that mean a nuke was detonated in the Sahara? Not necessarily, but it could have been. And that's the thing. It's so difficult to find definitive evidence. But starting in 2014, we really found definitive evidence. And I'll get into the heart of that now. And we'll start with a real-world religion called Zerastrianism. And for those that don't know, Zerastrianism was the religion of a place called Sumeria. Sumeria is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, and one of the things that is most important about Sumeria is they literally invented writing. Our oldest writing in the world all comes from Sumeria. And what a lot of people don't know, and it's very puzzling to academics and scholars all over the world, the Sumerian language is a language isolate. What that means, for you non-language geeks, you non-linguistic geeks, is this developed in isolation away from other languages. This is at the meeting point of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in one of the most heavily traveled areas of the world that has been the center point of trade, like the Silk Road goes through it, for thousands and thousands of years. So how is their language an isolate? How did that happen? That seems really weird. Because they would have intermingled with the people around them, and that would have modified their language, as happens in every other culture. You know, when words get imported or changed over time. Makes you wonder. Well, we turn to their religion for answers. If you look at Zerastrianism, they tell you. They had a god equivalent. It was one of the very first monotheistic, or possibly the first monotheistic religion in the world. And they had a god named Ahura Mazda. And Ahura Mazda comes to this guy Yima, and Yima's going to sound real familiar because he sounds a lot like Noah. And he says, all right, Yima, here's what I need you to do. I need you to gather the seed of 1,000 men and a whole bunch of animals. So we need mating pairs of all these animals and samples of all these plants that create food for man. And the reason for this is there's a great cold that is coming. So notice he didn't say flood, he said cold. But we have this cold on the archaeological record. It's called the Younger Dryas. There was a 1,200-year ice age where our world was just locked in ice. And it appears to have ended, from our scientific evidence now, with an asteroidal impact. The reason we think this is there's something called meltwater pulse 1A and 1B. Both of these pulses appeared to have been triggered rapidly, where the sea suddenly rose very quickly, as if a great deal of ice was melted, and global temperatures began to rise as well, very, very quickly. Why did that occur? Also backing this up, there are nanodiamonds over 60% of the Earth's surface from the same time period, which are consistent with an asteroidal impact. So an asteroid blows up and it fills the entire atmosphere with this cloud of particles, and they settle down over everything, and you can sort of see like when such a huge catastrophe occurs. And we have all of that supporting evidence. So that's the Younger Dryas impact theory. And obviously it's still a theory. It has not been proven conclusively, but there's a lot of supporting evidence for this. The Younger Dryas impact theory also lines up perfectly with Sumeria and Zerastrianism. And Zerastrianism, they started writing the religion down when they invented writing, which was a little over 5,000 years ago. But we don't know how old the religion is. We know that it was orally much older than that. And getting back to this society being an isolate, what Yima was instructed to do was, again, take the seed of 1,000 men and all of these breeding animals and plants and basically build a protective city to keep them safe during the Great Cold. You look around that area and, well, shouldn't there be cities where they would have said, like, what happened to those cities? They're still there. We started finding them, and we've found 5 of them so far. 5 of these cities. The largest and one of the first that was found was called Derinkuyu. And these cities are utterly massive, meaning hundreds of thousands of people could have lived here. And their defenses are completely sophisticated, so they have boulders on every level. So let's say somebody invaded the top level, you can, on the next level, push a boulder in place and block them off so they only get one level. And you have to wonder who lived there. All of the academic world has said they're probably associated with a much newer culture, something in the last couple thousand years, but nobody knows for sure. Because we don't know who carved these cities. We don't know who lived there originally. We know that other people have used them, but we don't know that they carved them. There's no proof that they were created in any specific time period because you can't carbon date stone. Yet, these cities seem to match perfectly with Zerastrianism and are located in the same part of the world. So it looks very much like this is the part of the world where these people kind of went to ground. And one of the things that could explain them having an isolated language and also coming out with a whole bunch of technology around them that nobody seems to have, like writing, is if they had disappeared from the world into these cities. If they literally retreated underground and for a period of time were able to survive that way. And maybe they were. It's hard to say. When I hear gather the seeds of 100 men, man, that sounds really weird from our society. So like 100 years ago, that might not have meant much. But today we have gene editing, gene therapy. We've mapped the human genome. We understand how to control genetics. We're making new species and bringing back, like we just brought back a dire wolf, for fun, because we wanted to see if we could do it. We created a dire wolf. We're one step shy of Jurassic Park. So when you hear seed of 100 men, what does that mean to you? If you're a Warhammer 40k fan, you already know the answer. It really sounds like you've gathered the genetic material of 100 people so that you can repopulate the human race. Basically, you've got a breeding pool so that after the calamity has passed, you're able to repopulate. And do we know the specifics about how all that worked? No, but we have all of the circumstantial evidence. And if that was the only thing that existed, you probably wouldn't have much to stand on, but man, I'm just getting warmed up. So in 2014, we discovered Gobeklet Tepe, a megalithic structure in modern-day Turkey that we believe was at least 9,000 years old. And it appeared it had been built, used for some period of time, and then buried for nearly 2,000 years. And what's fascinating about this site is not just its age, because it lines up with the aftermath of the Younger Dryas, but also there is a stone called the Vulture Stone, or Stone 43 at the site, which perfectly lines up astronomically with the Younger Dryas. Like they were trying to show us what the stars in the sky look like at the time of the catastrophe, so we would have a record of it. I find that absolutely fascinating. They thought that was important enough to record in stone before we think farming was even invented. They wanted us to know that that time period was significant to them. Why? And there are just so many questions that we have of connections between cultures. Why are, as an example, the Egyptian Great Pyramid and the Mayan Temple of the Sun, the Pyramid of Teotihuacan, why are those exactly the same base size, or so close that it's a rounding error that they're different? So they're clearly meant to be the same exact size. How does that happen when you have a pyramid in Mesoamerica and a pyramid in Africa, and they both have the same size base and are both oriented to the same directions and the same stars in the sky? Why? And I've heard academic theories that suggest that's just a natural thing that humans do. One coincidence I'll buy if we tended to always do the same thing. Like building pyramids, sure, that seems to be a global thing, and maybe we as people just do that. But when you also stack and they're always oriented in the same directions, and okay, sure, okay, maybe two coincidences. But now they have the same size base? What are the odds? What are the odds that the Temple of the Sun would be 10 meters, larger or 10 meters smaller? Why? Why isn't it? Why is it about the same size? Why do they line up so neatly next to each other? Why is it so close? And again, it could be a coincidence. It's definitely possible that all three of those things are simply coincidences. I'm not presenting that as definitive evidence, but there's just so many questions like that. If you look at most cultures, they say that some knowledge giver God came and gave them the gift of various types of knowledge. And this is present in Zerastrianism, in the Sumerian lore. It's present in Incan lore. There are even Native American tribes in North America that have legends of some of this stuff. So a lot of them point to what they call the Seven Sisters, which are the Pleiades, which are 7 stars in the night sky. And what's utterly fascinating is today you can only see 6 of those stars. And when I say today, I mean, let's say the last 10,000 years. You can only see 6 stars in the sky. Why do all these stories say 7? Because 100,000 years ago, all 7 stars would have been visible to the naked eye. And at some point between 100,000 years ago and today, 2 of the stars merged together, which is mentioned in some of the lore for the Native American tribes. They adjusted it to talk about what happened to the sisters, so 7 basically goes down to 6. That's interesting, because it tells you that this mythology goes back a lot longer than we would have assumed, probably orally. How long have these myths been passed down? Because we're a species that has been anatomically identical for 300,000 years. So if you took a human from 300,000 years ago and dropped them in today and cleaned them up and gave them modern clothing, they'd be indistinguishable from the other people around them. They just fit in. We're the same species as we were back then. Which started getting my mind, running. Well, why did our species suddenly take off now? So if academics are right, and we believe that technology is linear in nature, and it's usually only discovered and there's not some missing culture, then for 295,000 years, our species thought the coolest thing ever were rocks. And we just use rocks. And then all of a sudden, we decided rocks aren't cool, so we went from rocks to wood and bone and metal, and we started, we got to bronze, first copper, then bronze. Now we've got iron, now we've got steel, now we've got space age technology and nuclear weapons and AI and drone and genetic engineering and all the other things our society has built in 5,000 years. But we don't think that at any point in history, some culture started building stuff. Well, as I said, more and more evidence keeps coming out. Two of my favorites that have come out recently, we learned that there's a boat that is 40,000 years old. So 40,000 years ago, people were using boats just like they use boats today. 500,000 years ago, we discovered a half-flap joint. Now, if you are a woodworker like me, you know immediately what a half-flap joint is. It's still commonly used. My workbench currently has them. So I used half-flap joints. I built a gaming table. It's got some half-flap joints. Woodworkers, older than Homo sapiens, so these predate our species. These are some other type of hominid. Were doing that 500,000 years ago. We don't really know what people were doing at any given time. And if you look at the Vedas, you've got 100,000 plus years of lore. And if you look at Egyptian lore, theirs goes back 40,000 years. So maybe it's all mythology and didn't actually exist, but if you give it any credence at all and think of it as a historical record left by our ancestors, boy, it sure all does point to the same things. And I started asking big questions because some of the earliest lore that we have comes from the Egyptians. There's a temple in Egypt called the Temple of Edfu, where the tablets of Thoth are located, their god of knowledge. And in a nutshell, the relevant part of what Thoth said was that there have been multiple cataclysms, which is true in many different cultures across the world. The Aztecs have 5 suns, each one is the destruction of the world. Thoth said that it had happened more than once, and that this time he had preserved a bunch of knowledge to pass down to our descendants, the people that survived the catastrophe, implying that during his own time there had been another catastrophe that they hadn't been able to prevent that had knocked our species down back into the Stone Age, which I find very, very fascinating because that also fits the archaeological record because we know that there was a lot of Stone Age technology in the last 100,000 years. So something put us back there. At the same time, there also appears to be megaliths left over from that time. So remember, I said that the only thing that would remain would be enormous stone monuments, and everything else is pretty much gone, right? Well, what do we find all over the world? Enormous stone monuments that seem too old to exist, where you're like, that just doesn't seem right, it's so old. There's the Sage Wall in Montana. Some of the estimates put it back to 100,000 years. And that's just so crazy that we dismiss it outright, because it's like, well, who built a wall up there, 100,000 years ago? Well, we don't know, but the wall is there, and the scientific evidence seems fairly conclusive. And there's no known culture that could really have built it. It's not a Clovis wall. It definitely predates them, so who put it there? In Africa, there is Adam's calendar. And this one, I definitely feel free to look up any of these subjects you hear me talking about. They're all deep rabbit holes. Adam's calendar looks like circuitry from the air. And it covers hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. It's utterly massive. Who built that? Why? Is it all just art? Does it have some other purpose? What is it exactly? So many questions based on that age. So my hypothesis is, during an interglacial period, there was another civilization like ours that got advanced. And the reason I think this is, if you look at our climate over time, you can see where the big spikes are. And the last big spike that rivals the one that we're having today is over 100,000 years ago. And it seems to go on for a while. Like, it's much warmer than it is today here. So you can see the spike passing the point that we're currently at. And then eventually the spike collapses and the next ice age starts. Which would suggest that if there was a civilization back then, like ours, and then an ice age shows up, it's not good for the majority of your species. And that's a form of cataclysm. Possibly the lore around Yima doesn't have anything to do with the Younger Dryas at all, and is a callback to this earlier time period when a great cold came. And so they had to set something aside, like a genetic repository. Or it's all just conjecture. It's not true at all. But there is so much of it in so many different places and so many unexplained megalithic ruins that we just can't date to people, and so many myths that tie into each other that shouldn't be possible. As another example, if you look at these two gods, Zelottle from Aztec lore and Anubis from Egyptian lore, you're going to notice a lot of similarities, not just the appearance. So this is a Zelottle dog. Compare a Zelottle dog to what Anubis looks like. See a similarity? They're both associated with Sirius, the dog star. And here's the really interesting thing. Sirius is associated with the Egyptians with both Anubis and Isis, and they didn't really do things like that, so that seemed very odd. It seemed counterintuitive. Like, normally it'd be one star for one god and one star for another. Well, when we eventually got better photography, we were able to realize it's a binary star. So it's not one star, it's two stars. And one of them follows the other eternally, like a loyal dog would its master, like Anubis follows Isis. So more and more we find things in ancient religions that seem to correlate with real world phenomena that they couldn't have known about unless they had technology that was equal to ours in some areas, like astronomy. So maybe they could build incredible telescopes. We simply don't know. All of our incredible telescopes will be dust in less than 10,000 years, much less 100,000 years. All that would remain would be the stone monuments, and that's all we seem to find today from whatever this ancient culture is, if it existed. And if it didn't exist, do we really think that for 295,000 years our species just didn't do anything? So that brings me to, sort of the smoking gun at the end of it, because my book is about Atlantis. Let's talk about the myth of Atlantis. So Atlantis, of course, is the most compelling of all of the myths that we have from a previous age, theoretically. And it comes from a book released from Plato called I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the Critias, I'm going to say. It could be the Critias, I don't know. Here's the cover, you decide for yourself, or somebody more learned than I, tell me how we actually pronounce that. But I've read the book, and I've read everything he had to say about Atlantis. And the descriptions are chillingly accurate when compared to certain real-world features. So if you are an Atlantis buff, you've probably heard of the Eye of the Sahara or the Recot structure. If you haven't, it looks like an eye. It's in the Sahara Desert, and it perfectly matches what Plato had to say about Atlantis. He described it as a ringed city and as a Nessos, which mistakenly gets translated as island a lot. But a Nessos is a spit of land that has water on at least two sides. And so oftentimes 3 or 4. And if you look at his description, he describes it as rings. And the Recot structure has rings that pretty accurately correspond to what he described. Now, it also wasn't landlocked. In 2019, a Japanese study, a LiDAR study, found an enormous riverbed that bisected Africa, because we know 6,000 years ago the climate was different. It was much, much wetter in northern Africa. So there was a mighty river called the Tamanrasset River that flowed all the way across the continent, pretty much, from the northern part of the continent. And right at the end, before it empties out into what is now modern-day Mauritania, into the ocean, is the Eye of the Sahara in the middle of that riverbed. So basically it would have been an island in the middle of the biggest river of all. Like this crazy, crazy large river. Imagine the Mississippi, but like 20, 30 times wider. Is what this riverbed looks like. It just had so much water going through it. And we found the evidence for all this stuff. We see it. And interestingly, the CIA studied the Recot structure back in the 1960s, something to have to do with electromagnetism. That's all we know. But whatever they found was classified, and they never went back and they never did anything with it. Could be nothing. Could just be some report, hey, we came out here, saw an interesting phenomena, that was it. But why? Why was the CIA interested in this place? I mean, obviously it's led to a lot of theories and conspiracy theories about it. Like, what could this be? The counter I hear from a lot of people is, if this is Atlantis, or a part of Atlantis, because remember, there's supposed to be 10 kingdoms of Atlantis. Poseidon became the king of Atlantis, married their existing queen, and they had 10 kids, and each kid ruled over a city somewhere in their empire. So there were a lot of Atlantean cities all over North Africa and out like through the Azores, as an example, island chains, archipelagos, where some of their kingdoms were. Extending all the way into the Mediterranean. And depending on the theories that you believe, could also have been in Spain. So Plato says otherwise, but it's possible Plato's wrong about that. Anyway, I'm getting into the weeds. What would have happened to the city of Atlantis itself, and why is it gone? Well, now we're going back to our Younger Dryas impact theory. Imagine that's true when an asteroid hits. And imagine there is a wave 1,000 feet tall coming towards your city, and it's crushing the entire continent. So it blows over the side of Africa, out of the Mediterranean, just keeps coming, sweeping across Africa, comes right into Atlantis and just annihilates it. And everything down to the bedrock is swept up and away. So that's why there's no city or no proof of any ruins or any of that stuff, because it's all gone. That begs the question, where did it go? Surely, if all this stuff was swept away, it would have ended up somewhere we could find. It did. There's something called the Moritanian Slide. So off the coast of Mauritania is miles and miles of rocks and rubble that appear to have been swept out to sea from Africa. You can see where all the topsoil ended up, and you could see the results of this devastating flood, which in Plato's time, in Plato's record, he describes as it being like a sea of mud afterwards. So picture the entire Sahara, back then was plains. A wave sweeps over it. It leaves behind it just a muddy mess where like the whole continent is mud and then drying out. And of course, after it dried out, everything was dead. So now you've got a desert. And that's where the Sahara was born after this wave. Another piece of evidence, there's these mountains are called the Tassili Mountains. And in the Tassili Mountains, marine samples that correspond to about 12,000 years ago are found. So the timeline dates up to the Younger Dryas and just afterwards, where these marine samples, like in other places, they're millions of years old because at one point Africa was the floor of the ocean. But at this point, you shouldn't be finding them, and you shouldn't be finding them from 12,000 years ago unless a tremendous marine wave swept over the entire continent. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that is the case. So it looks like the city of Atlantis was at the Rekot structure, was swept away in a great wave. And after it was gone, and the other civilizations, I believe there were 3, and if you start reading my novel, you'll see where each of these were, all corresponding to real-world places, existed. I think Atlantis was its own empire. I think the ancestors of the Greeks had a different empire. I think that in what is now modern-day India was its own empire. I think Southeast Asia had its own empire. I think these were all separate civilizations, just like today you have a whole bunch of nations in different places because the architecture is different. But there are similarities. Everywhere you look, there are Asura and there are Deva. So when you heard me talk about Zerastrianism, it's Asura Mazda. Asura Mazda is mentioned in the Vedas. So in India, their lore also mentions them. All it does is swap which side is the bad guy. One side thinks the Asura are the good guys. One side thinks the Deva are the good guys. If you've heard the word devastation, that comes from the word Deva. And they just seem to be the same species, but think of it like Jedi and Sith. They chose their different sides. And the stories are fascinating. I love reading the lore. It's so interesting to me. Anyway, that gives you a very brief look at all of the various lore that I've had to look at and research to start getting just a piece of why I think Atlantis was real, why I think ancient civilizations are real. And I could go into this for hours and hours and hours. I could do this legitimately for probably 4 or 5 more hours, but I'm realizing this is probably already like a 45-minute video. And yeah, that seems a bit much. If you have questions, we'll talk about it more in the comments. I've already heard from another author friend of mine, Brandon Ellis, who is also writing an archaeological thriller and has obviously seen all of the same real-world evidence that I have because his setting backdrop, he said, was alarmingly similar to mine. Because we're both looking at Earth and saying, okay, this is what appears to be the case, like what really happened with religions and early religions and mankind. So I'm not going to be terribly surprised if his book is very similar to mine. Although I'd like to think my protagonist will be funnier. We'll see. I would imagine his will be more serious, but I don't really know anything more beyond the background. So, Brandon, when the book comes out, let me know. I will definitely pick a copy up. Anyway, if you have more questions about the archaeology, if you yourself are an archaeologist and you want to pick apart anything I've said, I would love it. I would love it. I've met some archaeologists who've proven things I believed wrong and who forced me to reassess my opinions many times. And to be clear, I don't believe aliens built the pyramids. We know when the pyramids were built. We know exactly when the pyramids were built. We know who built them. We know how and when they were built. We know what the prototype pyramids leading up to the Great Pyramids were. We know about the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid. We know about Imhotep, who made the first mastaba, which, imagine a one level in what's going to become a pyramid. It's just one flat level. And then they put another flat level on top of that, another flat level on top of that, so it becomes a ziggurat, a step pyramid. We know when Imhotep invented that stuff, so we have all that lore. But curiously, what we don't have is any information at all about the Sphinx. And I guess I'll close with this if you want one more archaeological tidbit that is why I think an earlier civilization definitely existed. The Sphinx has what appears to be thousands of years of water erosion. In the Sahara, which doesn't get any water. Now, the climate's been the same in the Sahara for about 6,000 years. The pyramids were built about 4,500 years ago. Almost 5,000 years ago. So if that's the case, why don't the pyramids also have the same water erosion if the water would have impacted them equally and they were all there from the same time period? And, one of the answers is they're made out of different materials. But there should be areas around the Sphinx enclosure that have the same aging on the temples if they were built at the same time. And there aren't. But we do know when there was enough water for that to be the case. And it seems to line up with the time period before this wave swept across the continent. So if the Sphinx had been built by this earlier civilization, that civilization was wiped out. We know the Proto-Egyptians up to 6,000 BCE were in the area building, forming religions that they themselves said they came from an earlier culture. What if they resettled the area and then rebuilt their culture as best they could and built the pyramids to honor their ancestors and had some very specific ideas about what that meant? It could very possibly be true. We just don't know. We do know the Egyptians believe it. They believed in an earlier time called Zep Tepi, and their king's list goes back 40,000 years. So maybe it's all myth. But what if it wasn't? And how do we know for sure? We've made some pretty stark, pretty sweeping judgments, but the further along that we come, the more it seems we're wrong about some things that we've taken for granted. And that's not even getting into the recent LiDAR scans that came out about the area under the Pyramid of Khafre. So it looks like they found an enormous complex under there. Nobody's been down there to explore it, but I'm tackling that topic in book 2 of my series. Anyway, I've rambled at you long enough. This video is just dragging on and on and on, and it's basically like 45 minutes of random facts about ancient history. Hopefully that wasn't too terrible. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you made it to the end and actually have some thoughts about Atlantis, I would love to hear them. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you believe? And either way, this is going to inform the plot of all of my books going forward in the series. So now you understand sort of how I cooked up the world and who the various empires are. They're what I think were real world empires that existed before the flood. And so their descendants or anybody who remembers their culture has certain technological advantages over the rest of us because I've theorized about, whatever tech they had back then. Anyway, I'm going to get back to the writing. I'll see you guys next week.